We come to the third Sunday in the season of creation, designated as Sky Sunday. And our gospel text is the pivotal moment in Mark's account of Jesus' death. It's an action-packed text, not least of which is the whole sky turning black in the middle of the day. Now, I don't know about you, but I find this actually a really hard text to relate to. As I was preparing this sermon, I was sitting in the library at United Theological College in North Parramatta. I was sitting at a desk facing the window. I was looking out onto bushland, backdropped by a glorious blue sky. There's quite a disconnect between the stunning sky which we regularly experience and the devastating darkness that we hear of in the text. It's an apocalyptic moment, and how can we possibly relate to that? The closest that I can get is not from my own experience, but from stories from my wife Radhika. In 2003, Radhika and her family lost their house in the Canberra bushfires. She describes how quickly it happened, how they only really had time to get to the car and drive away, leaving everything behind. It happened at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but the sky told a different story. Radhika described it as being pitch black, with parts that were red and glowing. Whilst I have difficulty relating to the darkness of this text, Radhika has no such trouble. In fact, at the time, Radhika's mum genuinely thought that it was the end of the world. It's taken a long time for her family to come to terms with what has happened. And at some level, they will never fully come to terms with it. How can you when you go through the experience of losing absolutely everything? The experience of fleeing for your lives? And the question that the family has struggled with and continues to struggle with is, where was God? When the sky turned black and the fire took their home, where was God? When the sky turned black, when the curtain ripped in two, when Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? When Jesus breathed his last, hanging there on that cross, where was God? If we ask this question of the whole Gospel of Mark, the answer actually becomes easier. In Mark chapter 1, we hear the story of the baptism of Jesus. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." In a similar vein, we can look at the story of the Transfiguration in chapter 9. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." I'm guessing you're getting the idea, but just to be sure, let's hear a couple more. From Mark chapter 6, when Jesus feeds the 5,000. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all, and all ate and were filled. And again from Mark 7, when Jesus heals the deaf man, then looking up to heaven, Jesus sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, be opened. And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. So where is God in the Gospel of Mark? God is in the heavens. God is in the sky. And this is by no means a strange concept, but entirely consistent with the Hebrew understanding of the universe. The Hebrews held a 3-tiered understanding of the world. The top level was the heavens, seen by us as the sky and the place where God resides. Then there's the middle level, where we exist, and the bottom level, the underworld. And this concept is not just a relic of the past either, but has major influences throughout Christianity. If I ask you to picture heaven right now, What do you see? I would be surprised if some, if not all of you, didn't have an image of heaven in the clouds pass across your imaginations at some point. I'm not going to get into whether this is a good or bad image of heaven for us to have, but rather to just acknowledge that such an image is so truly prevalent within the Christian consciousness, even today. And it stems from this ancient Hebrew worldview that is affirmed and applied by Mark. So from Mark's point of view, God exists in the heavens. God exists in the sky and interacts with the world from there. God speaks affirmations upon Jesus from the clouds, and Jesus looks to God in the sky as he performs the wondrous miracles, acknowledging God as the source of power and healing. So where does that leave us? Can we simply say that when Jesus hung on the cross, God was in the heavens, in the sky? It is here where the narrative of a skybound God begins to unravel, because we are told that darkness covered the whole land. Perhaps this is the reason why Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Because the place where he had received God's blessing, received the power to heal and to perform miracles, was now nothing but darkness. God is no longer where Jesus or where we expect God to be. So the question remains, where was God? There's one more text in Mark that might help us out here. And in Mark 13 has Jesus telling his disciples about what is to come, the destruction of the temple, the coming persecution, and then he speaks of the coming of the Son of Man. He foretells that in those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heaven will be shaken. Now, this is usually understood as a text speaking of the second coming of Christ, but the similarities to our gospel text for today are too significant to ignore. We hear both of suffering and of the darkening of the sky. So whilst this may be a second coming text, it also holds relevance to the story of Jesus' death. And it's the last line that is perhaps the most fascinating. And the powers in the heavens will be shaken. The heavens were shaken at that moment of Jesus' death. God was shaken to the core. But there's one line of Jesus' foretelling that comes next that I left out. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Want to see the power and the glory of God? Want to know where God is, God was when the sky turned black? You only need to look to the cross. There in that moment is where we find God. Perhaps there has not been, nor will there never be, another time where God is as present on earth as God was in that moment. And that's not to say that God is ever absent from us, because God is not. But in that moment we can see, we can discover the truest, most real, most transformative revelation of God. And that is God crucified. And not crucified for nothing, but for the renewal and restoration of all of God's creation to God's self in Jesus Christ. Where was God when Jesus died? God was hanging from the cross. And it takes an outsider to see this moment for what it really is. The Roman centurion who sees Jesus breathe his last sees this revelation in all its glory. Truly, this man was God's Son. But there's another key part that we need to remember, and that is that this is not the end of the story. Because from death comes resurrection. From death comes life. The prologue to the Gospel of John tells it best. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. The truth of the resurrection is that darkness cannot overcome the light of Christ, and that is the light in which brings life. N.T. Wright puts it this way: out of the unexplained cosmic darkness comes God's new word of creation, as at the beginning. Out of the unexplained cosmic darkness comes God's new word of creation, as at the beginning. Often we tend to think of God and creation as separate. We tend to see a disconnect between them. Yet that flies in the face of the gospel. Robert McAfee Brown writes that to believe in creation in the biblical sense is to believe that at every moment in time, the recreated order is dependent on God for its continuation. Without God, it would cease to be. It is not enough just to think of God as creating the world once upon a time and then sitting back and saying, "There now, I'll let it run itself." It's not just that everything exists because of God, but that everything continues to exist because of God. Everything in God's creation is utterly and completely dependent on God at all times. Now, this might be old news to you, or it may be a new notion for you to come to terms with. But either way, the question becomes, how then are we to respond to God and to God's creation? There are at least two ways that I can see. The first is simple: enjoy creation. God created the heavens and the earth, the seas and the sky, the fish and birds and animals of the land, and it was good. We are blessed with the privilege of life, of being part of God's creation, and one of the best ways for us to respond is to enjoy it. It is important to note that our enjoyment of creation is in no way the same as our dominion of creation. To enjoy creation is not to destroy it. And it's also not to ignore it. I don't know about you, but I am incredibly guilty of ignoring creation through my own dependence and, dare I say it, addiction to the screens and technology that pervade our lives. And I'd be willing to hazard a guess that at least some of you are in the same boat. That is why we need each other to help break the bondage of technology that we find ourselves in. And that's not to say that technology is a bad thing, because it's not. It's done so much to improve our lives. But when we become completely and utterly dependent on having a screen in front of our faces, we are missing out on the goodness of God's creation, that which gives us life. And let's help one another to take the time to enjoy it. The second way we can respond is the more difficult for us to come to terms with, because it involves trust. Trust is quite elusive in our world today. We only have to look at the state of our political system. There's not a lot of trust there at the moment. But before we get carried away with criticising others, we need to be mindful of our own situations. Life in the church can and is just as untrustworthy. And within the uniting church, much of the challenges that we face can be, to some extent, due to the lack of trust that exists between our different interconciliatory councils. There's something about our world, about our society, that makes trust very difficult. Sometimes we just need to trust. And more specifically for us, here and now, we need to trust God. We need to trust in the promise that God has given us, that through Jesus Christ there will be a reconciliation of all things to God. And we need to trust in God on this one, because it isn't something that we can do for ourselves. God has promised that all things will be reconciled to God, and we need to trust in that promise. But this isn't sort of a passive trust that absolves us from any responsibility or agency. Instead, it enables us to be God's agents in the world, doing our part in God's reconciliation, in the building of God's kingdom. It may sound like a dichotomy to need to trust fully and wholeheartedly in God, but to also work towards the kingdom ourselves. And it is. But this paradox is actually central to Christian discipleship. As one author put it, we need to pray. Like prayer is the only thing that works. And then we need to work. Like work is the only thing that works. It is only through both of these together that we will see the full fruits of discipleship. So as we trust in God's promise that all things will be reconciled to God, we are to live as people who are committed to that reconciliation. It's why we do our best to live sustainably. It's why we advocate for action against climate change. It's why we should take the time to revel in the glory of God's creation. Next time you can, take a moment to look at the sky. Let it be a reminder that God is here, not just in the sky, but in every element of creation. Remember that in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, we have witnessed the light of God overcoming the darkness. Remember the crucified God, God who faced and overcame death for our sake. And remember the call for us to live as a resurrection people, sharing the love of God throughout all God's good creation. In the name of the risen crucified one, Amen.